Hello, everyone. I have to say it feels really amazing to be here with you all, and I'm so thankful to have been invited to present, and also truly inspired by some of the talks from earlier today and thinking about, you know, like we're doing science in Antarctica, but it's really oftentimes about these personal connections that you make with the people and the legacy of those that came before. So I'm just really thankful to be here. Yes, if you notice my title slide, I included Ohio State because I'm not here anymore, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about I worked on while I was here at Byrd Polar, currently at the University of Colorado in Boulder. So I wanted to kind of set the stage. I did my master's thesis research on the Newell Glacier, kind of looking at snow pit chemistry and thinking about climate in the dry valleys, but the work was all planned before I was a student, and I wasn't on the field team that went to Antarctica. So kind of like Lois, who did a lot of her work without having been to the dry valleys, I was trying to understand what that environment might be like and try to work on the data and understand it without having actually been there. So fortunately, Lyons, who I worked with for many, many years, he had a grant that he was getting funded to work on the McMurdo LTER, and he asked me, hey, would you want to go to Antarctica? And so, like, of course I would. So I was able to go to the dry valleys after that, and everything just made so much more sense once I got to see the place in person. So I just want to mention that the project that I work on is a long-term ecological research project. Our McMurdo LTER is part of a larger network, and the LTER National Science Foundation funds all these different sites to do long-term research, most in North America and a couple in Antarctica. The other Antarctic site is at Faure. So they're a marine site. The McMurdo Dry Valleys LTER is a cold and dry end member ecosystem, and it's a polar desert. You've probably gotten a sense from a lot of the pictures that it's a really mostly dry place and cold. And our site, as I said, is a terrestrial ecosystem. So the McMurdo LTER was established in 1993, and we're now preparing for our 27th field season. And for me, that means my 27th field season too. I've been involved since the first year. A lot of what we do is collecting long-term data from all the different landscape units. So we work on the glaciers and streams, lakes, soils, and we do a lot of work on the weather and climate there. And one of the things we've added more and more, you can imagine with all these disciplinary sciences, we have glaciologists and stream ecologists and limnologists, but you know, as we work together over the years, we think now a lot more about the transitions between the different landscape units, like what happens to the wetted soils around the streams and so on. So looking at those transitions is more and more important for us. And one great thing is we get to work in teams and we share a lot of resources. And our thoughts about the dry valleys and the science that we do there has really evolved over time, but our most recent grant proposal, one of the things is enhanced connectivity between those different landscape features. So here's just a nice overview looking at the Taylor Valley, looking back towards the polar plateau, and you can kind of see that there's some alpine glaciers, and then in the valley floor we have lakes that are covered by ice year-round, and then a lot of rocky and exposed soils. And this picture is probably taken fairly early in the season when there's still kind of a little dusting of snow on the soils. And I'm just going to point out, since we can see here, like on the very valley floor, it's really dry, whereas the snow tends to stick around further up. So just a little map overview of some of the places that we work. The top panel there is the Wright Valley, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that Lois Jones did, and we've heard already that they were in the Wright Valley quite a bit. Most of the McMurdo LTER work is focused on the Taylor Valley, And in the last couple cycles of our grant, we've focused more on the southern valleys and done a little bit more work in Garwood and Mears. And you can see from the legend, kind of like I've already said, we have our lake monitoring streams, algal transect soil monitoring. One thing that's not on here is the glacier mass balance sites, but you can get a sense we kind of work all over on the valley floors, mostly in these various valleys. So here's just a little kind of conceptual model. This figure's been around forever, and I just saw Sarah smile when she saw it. It's like, oh yeah, that figure. But just a kind of a conceptual idea that we have solar radiation coming in, the glaciers, streams, and lakes, and the lakes are ice covered, and a lot of the lakes tend to be chemically stratified. There are algal mats living in the streams, and the amount of melt is usually driven by increases in solar radiation during the summer. So whether or not it's warmer or just sunnier, that's what really will drive melt in the summertime, and that creates the stream flow that then generates the lakes and the valley floors. So I just wanted to jump back and think a little bit about some of the early work from Lois Jones and Gunter Faure and how they kind of set the stage for how we think about the dry valleys and some of the work that was done. So Lois, in her dissertation, she addressed a lot of topics that are things that we still think about today in the dry valley. So she talked a lot about processes that happen on the landscape. She was one of the first people to really look at the process of chemical weathering in the streams and how the water that flows dissolves the solutes there. And she thought a lot about the sources of the solutes that are in the lakes. They addressed how these lakes evolve over time, and thought about like how old the lakes might be, and then thinking in terms of the climate history of the dry valley. So these were all things that they set out to work on that Lois in particular talked about in her dissertation. And I just threw up here a figure from Lake Vanda looking at the sodium profile, and like, it's complicated, and there's a lot of different layers and chemoclines, and thinking about, well, how could that have happened? You know, so they really sought to address thinking about like, how would you generate a profile that looked like that? So one of the key things that Lois did was using strontium isotopes, and I know this is maybe a complicated topic, but basically it's a little bit of a source and mixing problem. So she looked at the strontium isotopes in Lake Vanda and tried to understand if that could tell her where the solutes came from. And if you look at all the other kind of sources and materials that they analyzed, everything like the volcanics that were in the area and the glacier ice that would be a source of seawater from the marine aerosols, and then the seawater itself, everything had a much lower strontium isotopic composition. So that really led her to believe that the only way that she could see those isotopic ratios in that lake would be if there's chemical weathering going on in the Onyx River, which is the river that feeds into Lake Vanda, and the soils in the valley. So it's kind of like she didn't see anything that was higher concentration or higher ratio. So that really led her to figure out like what those sources might be. But, you know, having done all this work, I think she really had this like drive to see it for herself. And I'm sure she had a lot of unanswered questions. So, you know, it was her drive to really try to go to the dry valleys and see this for herself. And I put this picture of Don Juan Pond up here because when I first came to Ohio State and my office was downstairs, there's this cool picture, which you might see when we tour around, but it's of the Don Juan Pond and the team hiking down to Don Juan Pond to sample it. And I just think about them being there, like, you know, not really knowing that much, and like the area, very few people had seen it, and really trying to understand. You know, I just like felt so inspired by that team going to Don Juan Pond and doing the work that they did. So I've been working on the McMurdo LTER for a long time, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of our kind of key science things that we've discovered working over the years. People often ask, like, what's the most important thing you've learned, or what's the coolest part about working in the dry valley? So I just kind of wanted to give a few examples of some of the work that we've done. So a lot of our resources are put into looking at how the ecosystem responds to change, how organisms adapt, and I work with Byrd, Lyons, who's a geochemist, so we've done a ton of water chemistry, and then thinking about connectivity in the landscape. So one thing that Lois really didn't have the benefit of was a long time series to think about. So one thing we know is that it is a really dynamic and changing system. And this is kind of more, it's not actual data, but more of a conceptual idea about how much the system changes from year to year. And this would mostly be referring to things that happen in the summer. So you can imagine in Antarctica, it's cold, but in the winter, it's truly cold. In the summer, it's only a little bit cold. So we definitely get a lot of days where there's enough solar radiation or temperatures above freezing that we're gonna drive that glacial melt. And that's one of our most dynamic features, is like how much water is there from year to year. So thinking about different climate parameters, whether that's temperature or the amount of winds or glacial melt. Before the LTER started, there were all these legends about the high flow years in the streams and how wet it was and everything was melting. And the McMurdo dry valleys, or the MCM-LTER, began kind of like right at the end of that warming trend. And we know it was warming because we heard the stories of the people that had been there before, but also we knew that the lakes were rising, and that was really being driven by glacial melt. And so we started the McMurdo LTER, and we were basically in a period of very little melt and cooling and kind of stable summer climates. So it was kind of like waiting for water. But you know, Lois, when she was thinking about these landscape processes and so on, she would really have no idea, like, what is it going to do next year? So I just wanted to kind of show an example here of how dynamic this can be in the summertime. So in these two panels, it's taken about at the same spot. So in the 2001-2002 summer, we refer to this as the year of the flood, and it was the warmest summer that we had observed, and really warm around McMurdo, and as well as in the Dry Valley. So like in November, we wouldn't necessarily have seen any flow, but just about a month later, we had these really high stream flows in the Onyx River and all over the Dry Valleys. The whole system changed pretty dramatically that summer, just like scouring of algal mats that were in the stream channels, and a big change with this flow regime. So one of the key things that we've realized in the Dry Valleys is where there's water, there's life. So that's one of the things that anywhere there's a chance for liquid water, we see it. So as I said, my little asterisks here, it's like, it's not just even if there's water, it's even if there's potential for water, we're probably going to find signs of life if we look for it. And when I look at this glacier, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of potential for water in the Dry Valleys. So I want to highlight just a couple of our investigators. So Diane McKnight has been one of our McMurdo PI since the beginning. Her first Dry Valley season was in 87-88, and Diane is a hydrologist, but her expertise is looking at organic carbon. She's in charge of the algae ops team, so looking at algal mats in the streams, and she's also an expert on diatoms. And in the beginning of the LTER, one of our things that we do is like think about these changes to the environment. And we can't really do a lot of experiments, but we did get permission to do a small diversion of water from a flowing stream channel over to a channel that had not apparently had any flow in it for decades, as far as we could tell from like satellite imagery and other maps and so on. So we were able to direct a small amount of flow over to this channel that hadn't been wetted, and we were all really surprised. We thought, well, maybe something will happen, like maybe something will grow, but within hours, things started photosynthesizing in that channel. So that was pretty amazing to see that. So I just wanted to show these pictures of algal mats so you have a sense of what I'm talking about. I mean, when you think about the Antarctic landscape, it's very like brown and white, but there are things living where there's water, and these really dramatic, beautiful, bright colors. So kind of the green from the mosses and the various algae that are growing in the streams. I think this is Bowles Creek, which is my favorite stream in the Dry Valleys because it's just so like a rainbow of color. So following along with some of Diane's work, she's really looked at the distribution of diatoms in the stream channels. And there are about 40 different diatoms that have been described in the dry valleys, about half of which are endemic to Antarctica. So that means they only live in the dry valleys. And Diane loves to show, and she always says it very emphatically, and I realize you have to say it emphatically, the dot blot plot. So basically, that's the only way you can say it. So this basically shows some samples that were collected across the dry valleys. In the upper part of the table, there's the streams that have more consistent flow. Every year it flows, and in the bottom, it's some sites that maybe only have flow very intermittently, like hardly ever flows, or we've only observed it a few times. And so the endemic diatoms can live in any of the streams. They tend to be more prevalent in the streams that have rare flow. But the widespread or more cosmopolitan species of diatoms are really restricted to the streams that have flow every year. We also see some changes over time, like as stream flow has increased or decreased, we've seen shifts in the diatom communities there. Okay. So another one of our amazing PIs is Diana Wall, and she's again one of the original PIs. Her first season in the dry valleys was 89-90, and she's an expert on desert soils. She studies nematodes in particular, but she works on invertebrates and looking at adaptations, like how the nematodes persist in the winter when it's cold and dry. They go into what's called anhydrobiosis, where they basically just freeze dry themselves and persist for another chance for water. So before Diana's work, very little was known about invertebrates in the soils. I mean, people thought that there couldn't be anything living there. And very little was known about like how many different species and their distributions and what kind of adaptations or their role in the food web. So Diana's work really changed our view of the whole system. And I just put this quote in here, like from one of her early papers. Contrary to expectations based on earlier literature, nematodes were found in the majority of samples. You know, it's like, right, because no one really looked, or where they didn't see anything. And then, but I mean, this is the thing about Antarctica, right? Like so much is just undiscovered. But where they did find different invertebrates, that the concentrations or abundance was similar to other desert soils, so it wasn't that strange. But I also wanted to call out that Diana got her start working in Antarctica by analyzing samples collected by other people. So this is not, I think, a rare thing. Like a lot of us get our start by maybe getting some samples from someone. So, and I can't do this talk without mentioning my supervisor, who I've worked with and known since I was like 19. His first dry valley season was 1982, and he's a geochemist on the McMurdo LTR, and he started, again, one of the original PIs. So when I was thinking about like, how do I describe Barry, I realized he's a world traveler who always brings a sample bottle wherever he goes. And I think that he's probably a scientist so he can get paid to travel. He's an environmental geochemist and has expertise in a wide range of things, but I think has a real lifelong interest in saline lakes, brines, deserts, chemical weathering, and landscape processes. And I didn't include on here, but urban geochemistry, you know, impact of things on human health and so on. So he has a wide range of interests, and my voice is starting to tremble. But, you know, Barry and his students and I and others have worked a lot on thinking about the climate history in the dry valleys and how the lakes have evolved over time. And again, kind of picking up a lot of the same things of Lois Jones and others. I'm thinking about where are these solutes in the lakes coming from. I know I haven't talked a lot about the lakes, but they're salty and they have some really interesting chemistry. And then like one of our key findings was chemical weathering is definitely happening in the streams. And I have to say, Barry's also a really strong advocate for women. So my friend Sarah taking a picture of her meter in the stream. But in terms of aquatic geochemistry, I mean, that's another amazing thing about working in the dry valleys is that that the waters there span the range of natural water seen on Earth. So if you have a question about salts or solutes or lakes or how they work, even though they're ice covered, they span the range of like what you'd see on Earth. And I think I have to start going a little quicker through some of these. Here's a bunch of data. This was kind of fun just because Chris finally got the database working and we were able to get all the data together in one place. I made this graph. But basically, where there's water, there's chemical weathering. So we've really shown that, like looking at the streams and lakes across the dry valley. So sorry, I'm speeding through this. Thinking about connectivity. So our conceptual model, we've really been thinking more about this, how dynamic the system is and the connections and how the system will change with higher amounts of connectivity, which kind of means like warmer summer temperatures. But you know, it's going to be a different system if we have a lot of that lake ice melting and higher stream flow than if we have more discrete connectivity like we had in the early years of the LTER where there wasn't a lot of melt. So just some cool pictures of the winds, how they can erode the rocks and distribute sediments. And so this is a way to really redistribute carbon, nutrients, and organisms around the dry valleys. I'm going to skip this and just mention like here a new experiment that we've been doing, slime, which is really looking at as these lakes rise, how does the soil become lake bottom? And we found that like within a really short amount of time, like just a couple of years, we start getting these really lush mats forming on the what used to be soil and is now in the lake. So we've really taken this idea of like what we would normally just look at in the water column and expanding that into the moats and trying to understand how these lakes are going to evolve over time. So I just wanted to summarize like the work that was done by people that came before us has really helped us understand the system and given us a framework from which to build our observations and generate these long-term data sets, thinking about the modern processes in the landscape and their climate history. Water is super important, and it's a really dynamic system. And I would say the dry valleys just continue to surprise us as we work. And so I just wanted to, like I could probably spend 10 minutes on this one slide, but we have all our grant numbers and we really appreciate the support we've gotten from the NSF, but you know, NSF more than just the grant numbers, it's like really the people who are doing this work behind the scenes that make us look good, help us out when we need it, and also obviously the support contractors, and I named just a few here, but it's like a huge amount of effort that goes into making this happen. And a lot of my colleagues, and many of you are here, including my sister, Chris, Sarah, Amy, others, and I mean, there's just too many to name, but that's what I had.